Hope everyone's having a good day. I hope I can keep everybody awake. My name is David Sulock. I'm an environmental consultant. I'm employed by Curren Environmental. I've been doing environmental consulting for a little over 30 years. I'm also an instructor. I teach a lot of classes. And what I'm going to teach you today is regarding storage tank liability. All right. I'm going to lead in a lot of different things. There's a lot of photos. They're all photos from jobs we've done. It's kind of interesting. There's some key things maybe you want to screenshot here and there. I'll point that out to you. So, caveat emptor, buyer beware. It's the basis of home inspection. People do due diligence. Due diligence is what a reasonable person would do before they purchase something. Okay, doing your homework, professional evaluation. Your job is part of the due diligence of someone buying a property. Okay, and I always like referring back to like historic photos because things look different now than they did in the past. The photo to the left, on the left side, both photos are of the same area, different eras. Back in the day, yes, gasoline was 33 cents a gallon, right? Fill me up, okay? Nowadays, it's a walking downtown, okay? But obviously there were gas tanks in that location, which on the photo on the right, that was that big monster gas guzzling car, 33 cents a gallon. I show this to you because what you see now is not what it was in the past, okay? As an environmental consultant, when people buy commercial properties, we do environmental audits that go back 100 years, and we look at the property and be like, could anything have occurred at the property that could have caused environmental damage to it? Because the way the laws are, whoever owns the property owns the problem. This photo right here is from 1926 on the one side, and it was a lumber and fuel yard, and there was a little rail line that came in. And the circle I have right there, if you look at it, it says filling station, and you'll see GT, it stands for gas tank. So there was gas tanks on this property because they would get fuel coming in off like rail cars and such. Nowadays, it's an apartment complex, right? This person was actually going to get a loan to remodel a number of the units, and he found out that this was once a gas station, and he'd have to do testing for that, which he didn't really want to find out. This next photo, it's kind of interesting. This is lovely Atlantic City, New Jersey. It is all parking lots right now. But back in the day, before the casinos opened up in the 1970s, and I believe a lot of you might have been down Atlantic City recently, there was a bunch of different hotels that lined the blocks on the way to the beach. Okay. They eventually got torn down and the casinos kind of took over because there was more gambling and such, better things to do. But this next photo is right from this area. It's a sidewalk, and to the left is actually where these buildings were, right? That is the outline of an underground tank that was heating oil for one of those hotels. Okay. So imagine they demolish the hotels, but no one spends the money to address the oil tank. This is the oil tank right here. And just so you know, oil tanks are a cylinder. Whoever did all this, bashed down the top of the tank to make it lower so they could, put a concrete sidewalk on top of it. Again, there was money being spent to demolish stuff, but stuff that they didn't have to spend money on, they left and they put in place. And yes, the tank actually did have oil in it. Okay. So people don't do things because it costs money. Okay. This is kind of my lead into propane tanks. Propane tanks are obviously a form of heat, fuel source for like pools, for stoves and such, for people's houses. Okay. And a quick little rundown regarding propane, or a little bit of history here is right. And use this as a scenario, and I'll take segments out that I think you'll find useful depending on where you are in the country. You take a house from 1900. That house was heated by wood or coal, okay, up till about past World War II, because during World War II, you really couldn't get steel, you really couldn't get oil. But after World War II, we were a steel-producing country. We were also oil-producing back in the day. So when you had coal, and I taught a class once, this woman, said coal was terrible. My father made me go down the basement and shovel coal into the hopper, and it would feed the heater. And then in the morning it'd be freezing. I have to do it again. And she's like, you know how hard it is to go to sleep after you've shoveled coal just before bed? It's like doing aerobics. And she's like, we were wealthy. We had a hopper. Some people, he just shoveled it right into the furnace, right? So you can imagine people want to get rid of cold, and they want the oil heat. Okay, and how they did that was they called their family coal company and said, hey, we want to get rid of coal. Like, oh, we sell heating oil now. We'll put a tank in the ground for you. You can buy the tank, and we'll install it, and we'll sell you heating oil. It was wonderful. But then they realized that Family Heating Oil Company charged a couple cents more a gallon. So they went to Cheap Family Heating Oil Company, the competitor, and they bought heating oil from them. So the company that installed the tank thought they'd have a client for life. They didn't. So the propane companies learned that. And basically what they did is they installed propane tanks on people's properties, which is their cost, their burn. And then you were forced to buy propane from them. All right. So that it was locked in. So this is kind of leading into my story here. So these are what the propane tanks look like when they're fresh, clean, maintained. This is what weather causes. Weather beats up on them. Okay. Everything wears out. You're not, you might think you're getting older with age. You're not. You might be getting smarter. You're not getting physically better. Okay. Um, Interesting about propane tanks is most of them were owned by the propane company. So they're forced to buy it from them. Okay. And in those contracts, the propane company says you must buy from us. And if you decide you want to stop doing this, you want to get rid of the tank, the burden is on you to actually remove the tank, make it possible that we can transport it on DOT roads. Okay. Because they want to give a disincentive for people to stop using propane. Right. Now, what happened was Family Propane Company got bought by Mega Propane Company and lost some of the contracts and such. And basically says, you know what? We don't want anything to do with these propane tanks. We don't own them anymore. We don't want to deal with them because there's a liability associated with them. So people get stuck with these propane tanks on their property because of really not niceness, I'm going to say, on some of the propane companies, but loss of the contract. If there was a contract saying the propane company was going to remove the tank no matter what, I've never seen one of those. I remove a lot of propane tanks. Okay, so where do propane tanks get used? This is actually a wealthy area, $1 million homes, and it's on the bay. But of course, people on the bay must have a swimming pool, right? You're close to the beach, but you want a swimming pool, and they want the swimming pool to be heated, so they have a propane tank there to heat that. Very common. So where do you have propane tanks? They basically look like submarine manholes. Okay, they have covers, fake covers you can put on that, which kind of looks like a barbecue grill cover, like for a little fire pit. But they're basically these manholes. Some were kind of hidden in landscaping. Some just kind of look, I'm not going to say butt ugly, but really not that attractive. I think that's like a Land Rover in the photo, and you have this propane tank sticking up out of the ground. And you notice it's typically a good distance from the house. Okay. Or like this one, it's in a landscaped area, a distance from the road. And again, you see these tops. So what is the top hiding? The top is hiding the standpipe for it, where the valves and everything are. And you can see it, it's typically several feet down, right? So you go to a house, and again, the propane company took the time and effort to go to the property, dig out soil, haul it away, put the tank in the ground, hook it up to the house, thinking they're going to have a client for life. In this house right here, the tank is all the way in the back corner, and the photo kind of in the center. That's where it is. It's hidden away, and that's the gauge on it right there. These people stopped using the propane tank. Okay, they wanted it removed, and the tank, if you look at it, it's 60% full. So, 1,000-gallon tank, 600 gallons of propane. They no longer use propane because the propane furnace died, and went with natural gas because they want natural gas to run their stove and their hot water and their dryer. Okay, and they wanted it removed, and I'm like, there's an expense involved with actually extracting that propane or flaring it off, which I'm going to get into. Again, you have this lovely backyard that has a basketball hoop, and the propane tank is there in the bushes. This next photo will show you that. You can kind of see the propane tank kind of center of the photo past the grass into the shrubs. This is a very nice house. They stopped using the propane tank. And again, people stop using it because the heater dies and they need a new heater, and they decide not to go with propane. And it's a real quick process. This tank is 80-some% full. Okay. And you're going to come across properties where there are propane tanks in the ground and be like, well, no one's really using it. You just leave it there. I work for a lot of propane companies, and no one at any propane company has ever told me that they would feel comfortable having a unused propane tank in the ground, having propane in it for any number of risks. Okay. When you go into tank sizes for propane tanks, they're typically longer and narrower than like a typical heating oil tank. A 1,000-gallon heating oil tank, it's about 10 foot long. A 1,000-gallon propane tank is close to 16 feet long. So you can imagine when you remove it, you have this much material to remove to get to the top of the tank, and you're digging a very long, narrow hole that could be, you could have a patio on top of it. You could obviously landscaping on top of it, and you're just disturbing a much greater footprint, which of course you can beautify. Like any backyard you've ever been in, you'll see that there's a swimming pool. You're like, swimming pool looks great. When that swimming pool was being constructed, it was a war zone. It looked terrible, but you can make it all nicey nice. But there's an expense involved. And part of my point of discussing these things with you is to point out the fact that there's an expense that people have that they don't realize. And it's something that they should be aware of, and because it's a burn on them. And I've never seen anyone be like, thanks for spending all this money for decommissioning, removing my propane tank, because they didn't really get all that much out of it. And they wish they had addressed it before they bought the property. Here's a typical example. Here's one in the rear corner of the yard. Obviously, that's the shed back there. That's the rear fence. So you know it's the farther point of the yard where this is, where equipment has to drive across the area. You dig up the tank. This was actually a small tank, and you're disturbing this area. What you can't really see is all the dirt we have over here. The longer the tank, the more of an area that you're going to wind up disturbing, right? In this property, you don't even see the house. You see where the propane tank is. It's far off the property, okay? You'll see the tire ruts going to it. If we had taken more photos, you would see how much that yard got more beaten up because we're driving across it with a machine to dig it. And then we're driving across to carry the propane tank away. But we're also bringing dirt back there to do that. And you're disturbing it. So you're going back and forth, running up to people's property. Could be 100 feet, could be a couple hundred feet. It's typically not directly right off the driveway. That's it coming out of the ground. I love this photo, okay, because there's a propane tank in the ground there. That's what you see dead center of the photo. But there's a newer one right behind it. So case in point, they stopped using the one propane tank. Either they divorced themselves from the propane company, or there's a problem with the propane tank. So rather than remove that tank, they put a new tank above ground. So the people buying the property, they were advised that that underground tank should be removed because it seems to be a liability. I just like to show you what, like this tank was not meant to be buried because there's actually legs on it. It was meant to be above ground. So going to like cost, expense, and liability with a very unused propane tank, because a propane tank that's in use, really no harm, no foul. You're using it. If there's a problem with it, it's not going to function. Your heater, whatever you're fueling, is not going to work. It can be investigated. You have fittings on this that they don't open, people don't touch them, they rust, things wear out, you can have issues. Okay. So typically when people stop using the tank, everyone's like, oh, it's empty. And it's very rare that someone can use it to burn off, if you're running your house, you're going to crank the heat until it completely dies, and then you're like, all right, now I'm going to make the conversion. That's typically not how it works. It's typically the furnace breaks, right? So leaving some quantity of material in there. And here's the rub that a lot of people don't realize. When you see an empty reading on a propane tank, it could very well have 12% remaining fuel in the tank, right? 12%, 1,000 gallon, 12%, right? So 30 gallons remaining at would be 250, 60 gallons at 500, a fair amount of propane. Okay, these are all tanks that people had us get involved with and said, oh, they were empty. And I said, go out to the tank, lift the submarine lid, take a wet paper towel, rub that the gauge cover, and take a photo of it. And they're like, oh, that's 25% propane. Oh, the other one's almost 60%. And let me tell you, a lot of husbands have this dream of taking the propane tank, hooking up their gas grill to it, so they never have to buy gas again. It's like a dream, but it's a fool's dream. It just doesn't happen. So what do you do with that propane? Typically, the propane supplier does not want it back. They want nothing to do with the tank. They want to sell propane. They don't want the risk associated with it, especially because it's all rusty. It's a hazard to their employees. So what do? You can flare it off. It's a controlled burn. The one on the right is a very nice controlled burn because there's nothing around it, and you can burn the propane pretty quickly. The one on the left, not so much, because it's a wooded area. We had to go there, blow leaves, and you have to burn it, and it can burn for days. And you have to monitor because you don't want some bird or squirrel coming across there or leaves catching fire and doing it. And you typically have to notify the fire department that you're doing this, because the neighbors surely are going to call, and people are going to smell burning propane and be like, what's going on here? But I mean, that's one of the ways that you can extract propane from a tank, so you can get it down to a point that you can remove it or open it up and you can fill it. okay? Because it is a pressurized vessel. And for the record, it's liquefied under pressure. When it comes to atmosphere, it's a gas. So there's a hole in the propane tank. It's not going to leak and cause contamination like a oil tank, okay? But there's a financial drain on the people. You could spend $3,000, you could spend $8,000 decommissioning a propane tank, depending on the effort to remove it, propane that you have to extract to get rid of, and not counting any kind of landscape restoration. Why do people not want to, the propane companies don't want to mess with the old propane tanks? It's dangerous, man. You could really cause harm to yourself. Case in point, this was a school. It's one of our clients, and they had a propane tank for emergency generators. They stopped with the propane, and they went with natural gas, okay? They had a bunch of propane in it, okay? We were able to get a propane company to come to extract the remaining propane. But there's an expense involved. As you see, there's 2 trucks there, 2 people that you're forcing the propane out into the other truck to gather the propane. So here's a propane company extracting all the propane that they can get. Tank's still not empty. You still can't unscrew the lid to it. It's still under pressure. So then we have to go with actually a very small burn mechanism to burn off the remaining propane. It's still there. It's still under pressure. Okay, because you're not going to get everything out of the tank. So you're spending time to do that. You can't use a big torch for that because it's a wooded area. There's trees around, as you can see, right? So in lieu of removing it, so I just want to go back a slide. You can see where the ledge is, like it's kind of elevated. Removing that tank could interfere with the retaining wall, obviously the asphalt. So in lieu of removing it, it would be filled in place. How you fill it in place, you burn off all the propane, you open it up, and you can actually manufacture, we've actually manufactured foam, we were rigged for it, and you inject the tank with a non-shrinking foam, an inert material. So it's really technically no longer a tank because you can't store product in there anymore because you have foam in there. And how you make the foam, you have to make it, it's like a cooking process, it's a chemical process that has to have a certain weight, and it almost looks like you're injecting this Stay Puft Marshmallow Man into it. So I showed you a bunch of different lids, right, regarding what would look like for a propane tank, okay? They were putting a cell phone tower in at a complex, an apartment complex. Look dead center of this photo, okay? Dead center, the wall of that building. Here's my close-up. That right there is a gauge for a propane tank. No one involved with the project of putting a cell phone tower in knew what that was. They're digging to put the foundation in, and they come across a propane tank. Stops everything. It's a cell phone tower. It was like, now you get permits for that. Everything stops. The project is off about a month because it takes a while to get permits, and you have to go through the steps of inerting the propane tank and such. And that was the tank coming up out of the ground. Okay. I just point this out to you. It's just that you might see a measure like that and you're like, what is that? It's like, it's not really common for something to see. It's a remnant to a propane tank. And why didn't someone remove the propane tank? Because it costs money. Okay. And you're going to find this time and again why people leave tanks in the ground is because it costs money, because they stopped using it and money was spent to replace that fuel source with something else and was cut from the budget. Yes, some regulations are not so encompassing to require you to address that tank when you take it out of service. And I'm sure that's the case. I work in 3 states, and that's how it is in those 3 states. I guarantee it's rampant across the country in areas that you actually hang your hat. So bottoming out regarding propane, it's the fact that there's an expense involved that whacks people in the face. Okay, and people should be aware that that tank is there. It's been left there only for someone to save money. It could be something that's going to come up in the transaction when they buy it, that maybe their insurance company's going to be like, we don't want you having a propane tank unused in the ground. You will sometimes hear about an explosion at a property somewhere, and a lot of times they say it comes from a propane tank. Okay, it's also gas leaks. Okay, I am going to move into other heating sources. As I said earlier in this talk, we talked about coal being it. Okay, so again, how coal worked was you had a room in the basement and there was a coal chute. The coal person would deliver it, and then you would shovel the coal and put it in either into a furnace, okay, or what you would do is you put into a hopper and it would slowly feed in. Okay, it was a pain in the butt to do. So people went with petroleum storage tanks. So this is a before and after picture. Back in the day, people had coal, okay, and that was a coal yard, also a gas station, and they eventually went to sell heating oil and eventually closed down. This would be the opening you would have for throwing coal into a furnace, okay. As you know, we mine coal in the United States. Actually, certain states still use a quantity of coal for fuel. I actually use the wood coal for barbecuing. I like that a lot. This is actually, I love this picture because this was a coal room in the basement, and the coal was left there when they stopped using it. And on the on the right hand side are actually above ground heating oil tanks, just to show the transition from coal to actually oil. And you might be thinking, well, Dave, what about natural gas? Well, natural gas was a monopoly and it was expensive. Fuel oil was sold by your local family fuel oil dealer, supported your little league team, maybe bought you a beer if you golfed together, and it was a local business, okay? And they know they had to be a competitive business because they had competitors who were just as well as family-owned businesses wanting your business. The gas utility, they want to run a gas line in front of your house and hook up, and you're going to pay whatever they want to pay. Gas didn't really actually become economically better than heating oil until the early 1970s during the oil embargo, where the Arab countries kind of cut off the flow, oil prices went up, and the government kind of forced the gas utilities to lower their prices, and it became more prevalent, okay? But back in the day, coal and heating oil fed these old octopus boilers. Crude oil was distilled from to create kerosene. First oil well in the U.S. was actually Titusville, PA. John D. Rockefeller's company, who was a robber baron of the day, is actually ExxonMobil today. So the gas company was more expensive and they wanted your business, okay? The oil was more competitive, and if I know anything, people are cheap and they typically take the cheapest route, okay? I'm talking to you from New Jersey. I'm about 7 minutes from the city of Philadelphia. Yet we are Eagles fans, sorry. And in this region of the country, heating oil was very prevalent. But I get phone calls from tanks from like Carolina, Seattle, Chicago, just because people have questions on stuff. So oil was used throughout the United States. California, I have someone, they're putting a pool and they find an oil tank in their yard, right? The golden age of heating oil, okay, was 1900 to the 1980s. Really, after World War II, it boomed because we had a surplus of oil and we had a steel-producing country. So the conversion from coal to oil allowed people to build these tanks cheaply and of high quality, and you never had to shovel it anymore. The oil naturally came to it. Back in the day, you had to stick the tanks for the oil. Nowadays, for years, they've had this degree day system that basically monitors how cold it is, and they know how much oil you use. They know for how much auto delivery they would need for you, okay? And also, a lot of times, gas wasn't, there's moratoriums. People put neighborhoods and roads in, and if gas wasn't in at the get-go, you couldn't put a gas line. You couldn't open up the road. So some developments were built where you couldn't have gas line. You had to go with oil. Now, of course, it's depending where you are in the country. All right. Where were tanks used? For heating oil, for heating pools, heating garages, because I show you this photo right there. It's tough to see. That's a garage with a chimney, okay? Anytime you see a chimney, you know something was burning, okay? And for some sort of fuel source, for some sort of heat. That was a long ago, possibly man cave, man garage, right? They had an oil tank that actually heated that garage. And it's a completely detached garage, right? Also heating colleges, outbuildings. It was used for hot water and such. Common sizes, and this is something you should kind of remember, for oil tanks, 290 to 300 gallon, it's very common, okay? 500 to 550, and for larger homes, you'd see 1,000 to 1,500. I had someone email me today, they had a tank in their basement, and he emailed me, and he's like, it's a 1,000-gallon tank, and I'm like, it's actually not, it's a 290. A 1,000-gallon tank would be significantly bigger, and a lot of the tanks have a UL, Underwriters Laboratory label on the top that will tell you the size and where it was made. Also, sometimes the newer tanks have a sticker on them, okay? So uncommon size of the tank that you're probably not going to find across, and to make you look smarter, 150-gallon tank, about 355-gallon drums, that's not really a manufactured size, nor is 750, 850, or 1,100. I have seen a number of 750s in some unique circumstances, but it's very uncommon. All right. The old tanks that people made, single wall steel. The Congress passed legislation in the 80s regarding upgrading tanks on a commercial level because metal rusts. Rust never sleeps. Okay. And these single wall tanks will fail. That's why we have double wall hulls for tankers. Exxon Valdez, great example, right? So the tanks you see today at gas stations are a tank like this, an STI P3 tank, right? It's a double wall tank with a fiberglass coating on the outside, and it has all these bells and whistles to it, leak detection monitoring. There's a computer algorithm that runs all the time to know if you're getting any water entry or any kind of loss of product, right? And a double wall tank is just the way it sounds. This is a double wall tank right here. It's a tank within inside of a tank. And they typically have a probe in that interstitial space. Interstitial space is the space between the two tanks, right? And if they typically have a gauge in there, so it can monitor if there's any liquid coming in or petroleum getting out. And yes, they actually have these. This was actually a property in Delaware. And on the right-hand side, that is not the Steelers logo. That's for the Steel Tank Institute. This was a double wall tank with a fiberglass coating on the outside. The idea behind that coating is metal's not touching the wet soils. It reduces the rust potential of the tank. So older tanks, bare steel, newer tanks like this. Not that common that actually people put these quality tanks in the ground, quite frankly. You can go with above ground tanks. This Roth tank on the right-hand side, they were engineered in Germany. If I want to say a tank is sexy, I think a Roth tank is sexy because it has like almost like a milk carton liner on the inside, and they have aluminum on the outside, and they have a gauge to know if they're in that space and there's any leakage. They come with industry leading, and I don't sell these at all, 20, 30, 40-year warranties. It's a really quality tank. Outstanding warranty. They come with insurance policies. Whenever I see a tank like that on a property, I'm like, someone invested for the long term. Because a lot of times people are thinking, I'm going to be moving in so many years. I don't need the 40-year shingle. I don't need the better quality. All right. But I also tell people that if I have an older home and I see a newer tank like this, I'm like, what happened to the older tank? Because the world I live in, people don't spend money unless they have to. All right. But there are also other tanks, and I'm not bashing them whatsoever. I'm just telling you that there are tanks. Granby is a big manufacturer of tanks. And you know Granby because there'll be a G on the end of the tank. And this one offers a 10-year warranty. 10 years for a car, pretty awesome. 10 years for a tank, not so much. 10 years goes pretty quick, right? This is a listing of different tanks that Granby makes. And you'll see 25, 25, 25, the column kind of to your right. There's also 10-year, 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 10-year. More 10 years than there are 25 years, right? So why would someone have oil heat to a house? Older the home. Oil heat was kind of phased out in the 1970s, right? There's liability with oil heat. And the fact is when an oil tank leaks, there's no alarm, there's no bells or whistles to let the homeowner know that that's the case. And it leaks, it can leak and cause contamination, and all states have standards for petroleum levels in the ground. When you exceed a level, you're going to require remediation, which means spending money, right? This house right here was from the turn of the century. It had coal, and also had, that actually was about a 1,500-gallon tank that they had on the property. I show that to you for perspective. Nothing has been enlarged or changed in the photo, right? So, you know, a house like that, as you can imagine, not a whole lot of insulation, probably drafty. And because it was probably installed after World War II, they probably put a larger tank in so the fuel oil dealer could come and drop a bigger load and give that person a discount for it. And it was less likely to run out of fuel because you had so much excess capacity. But a lot of people think tanks are kind of ugly. So people put tanks, they bury them. This tank is in a crawl space. And I'll tell you something. Difference between an above ground storage tank and an underground storage tank. Okay. You might look at that and call that an above ground tank. It's actually underground. And because you see the majority of it is underground, but by federal definition, if 10% or more of the tank is below grade, it's considered underground. So 90% above ground, 10% below ground, it's considered an underground tank. So I kind of told you earlier that it was a lot of independent fuel oil dealers installing these tanks, right? So everyone has an opinion on things, right? So where do they put them? Anywhere they want it. Top photo was underneath a side porch, not a deck. Back in the day, it was a porch. This was behind a house. They put a deck on it. The upper right-hand corner, that was a crawl space underneath a porch as you walk in the front door. That one right there, they built some stairs on top of it. Tanks were installed willy-nilly wherever they wanted to put it. All right. Why are oil tanks a concern? Rust never sleeps. Oil can contaminate soil and groundwater. And I actually teach an environmental regulations class. And I tell people that environmental regulations are not fair. Before the 1970s, before the EPA was formed, I asked people, do you know what pollution was called in the 50s or 60s? I would say it was called legal. It was allowed to do because there really were no environmental regulations. Since the regulations came into effect in the 70s and people were polluters, legal polluters, right? It's come out with a term called RP, responsible party, saying that if you cause the contamination or you own the property with the contamination, you are the responsible party. So you're like, hold on, I own it, but I didn't cause it. I'm the responsible party. That's the way the law is because pollution was legal back in the day. So you have contamination on a property, there's an expense associated with cleaning it up. As I said, top of the line for like a propane tank, maybe $8,000 or something, right? A lot of money. $8,000. I could put a patio in, deck. I could go on vacation somewhere, right? Oil tank leaks can be tens of thousands of dollars. It devalues the property, might be hard to get a mortgage. Insurance companies kind of wrote these policies out to cover these because they had big losses. And you're like, how does Dave know that? I was on the Today Show. Okay. Great story. I was contacted. I got an email from the producer. I thought it was one of my friends pranking me. I looked her up. I contacted her. And she surely was with NBC. And I said, what were you talking about? What are you looking for? And she said that Al Roker had read an article about a couple who had bought a house in Massachusetts. They had an oil tank in the basement. Home inspector inspected, said the tank looked good, looked newer, right? They smelled oil and they went down the basement and the tank was leaking. They called the fire department. The house smelled. They moved out of the house and they called their insurance company. And the insurance company, said, you don't have any coverage for it. And they're like, what do you mean? You knew it was there. And like, it's an excluded part of the policy, right? So he thought that was a really great idea. So the idea behind it, they want to do a story regarding how do you manage your oil tank? How do you maintain it? Which you think a house should come with a instruction manual. I said that wasn't really a great idea. And I said, you probably should more talk about the liability of these because no one really knows. Everyone expects it to last forever and it really doesn't. And the reason being is environmental regulations. You're like, how can environmental regulation harm the environment? Well, if you're old enough to remember acid rain, we don't have it anymore. We solved that. That was awesome, right? Why? Because sulfur was a leading cause of that. So they reduced the sulfur content in fuels. They put scrubbers on coal-fired plants and such. But sulfur is an antimicrobial, antibacterial. Like you'll hear about sulfites in wines, which are naturally occurring in wines, but they also add sulfites to stabilize wine as a preservative. Okay. That being said, you take sulfur out of wine, sorry, out of oil, right? Moisture gets into the tank through condensation. Water goes to the bottom. Oil and water don't mix. And what happens is you create a sludge that's acidic and it forms holes in the tank. All those holes you see in the photo right there are from the sludge on the bottom of the tank corroding it. But weather conditions also cause tanks to corrode on the outside. That tank on the left is rusty. The tank on the right, it's painted red. They call that primer red. It typically comes from the factory that way so it doesn't get scratched on the way there. And then wherever you put it, you typically paint it the color of what the house is or the basement. You don't typically leave it like that. But as you can see, moisture is affecting it and the paint is becoming deteriorated, which is a protective coating, and you see the rust forming. Here's a picture of the sludge that I was talking about sitting in coating on the bottom of the tank, right? Here's a great photo. You see that tank does not look clean or shiny or anything. This tank does. This is the newer tank. That's the very bottom of the tank. Low sulfur in both diesel and heating oil. Because of the sulfur, you get corrosion, and you can see all that rusting and pitting on there, right? Which you wouldn't expect. It's kind of an oxymoron because you're like, oil's a lubricant. So I expect the inside of the tank to be perfect, and I'd be worried about the outside. You actually have to be worried about both. We recently did this tank. That is a newer tank, and that is rust inside the tank. And it's rust, it's forming in a weird fashion. radicals. It's like you really can't control it. But yes, it's rusting there because, for one, these tanks aren't as well made as they were in the 1950s, quite frankly. I'd actually rather have a tank from the 50s than the 70s, because the 70s was a lot of imported steel. But the newer tanks, I don't really think are, they cut corners because they're just not as thick. It's, materials it costs money. This tank right here, as you can see on the right-hand side, the top was painted white, the bottom was painted that color, and you can see the tank leaked at the bottom there. What happens too is when you fill the tank with oil, oil goes down, it can rub the bottom of the tank. And it's like when you go to a museum, they say don't touch anything, because if a million people touch it, it starts to wear away. Well, this tank leaked, and that's what you got. Here's a photo, and I'm showing this to you because, again, you look at the bottom of the tank and you see all these holes in it. I apologize for the watermarks for the Curren. We do that because I keep seeing our pictures on other people's websites. I just show that to you because the holes are all along the bottom where the sludge is. So why do people bury a tank? They're not very attractive, and it allows you to store more, okay? And there were no environmental regulations, and no one really thought that a tank leak would be an issue. So you can imagine those are two 290-gallon tanks. So that is about 600 gallons of capacity. It takes up space in the basement. Would you want that in your basement, or do you want it outside? And here's a tip for you. When you see a handle on the end of a tank, typically a newer tank, more like from the 90s. No handle, typically an older style tank. So people have these tanks above ground. What do they do with them? The one on the top left, they put a shower curtain around it. The one on the one to the bottom left, they'll build a shelf around it. The upper right one, that's primer red. They just left it right there. And these people, they painted the tank white. They put it outside. Not really a great tank, great looking tank if you want to have a picnic outside in the backyard. The tank on the right, you can bury a much larger tank, put in the ground, have greater capacity. So if you don't want the look of a tank above ground, people buried them, or they wanted larger capacity, and that's what happened. I'm going to circle back to environmental regulations to give you a little bit of a knowledge base, a good talking point, maybe for Trivial Pursuit. All right. This river fire actually helped spark environmental regulations. It made the cover of Time magazine, the Cuyahoga River fire. Basically, someone saw water on fire and said, oh my God, what's going on? Wherever you are and has any kind of industrial past, factories, manufacturing was on waterways, both for deliveries, rail line could be there too, but also for discharging because it was legal. So obviously the water's not burning to the chemicals on top. Okay, so because of this, EPA eventually was formed. You got the Clean Water Act that you can't discharge without a permit to waterways. So EPA was formed in the 70s, first Earth Day, 1970, passed the Clean Water Act. And so the federal government passed all these regulations. And I want to give you a good tip, okay? I've been doing this 30 plus years. I've worked on 2 EPA sites. A lot of people misuse EPA and say, oh, that's an EPA site. I highly doubt anyone taking this webinar, listening to this, is going to be involved with an EPA site. EPA is federal. It means it's really kind of serious, okay? But once the EPA was formed, the states formed their individual state agencies that typically would manage small issues and such. That's the people that you would be dealing with, not EPA. So you need to realize something, that what was bad today was good in the past. Asbestos was a wonder fire. Didn't burn. Great insulator. They used it in everything. Lead paint, dried fast, right? Resist moisture, wore like iron, put it in everything. Let's put in paint, varnish, and stains. That's what they did. Mercury, let's put it into a thermometer. Let's put it into mercurochrome if you're old enough to know what that is. And single wall steel, they thought, hey, it's wonderful. We make it in the United States. U.S. Steel. If you remember the original Godfather, the mafia was making all this money, and they were saying we're making more money than U.S. Steel. The steel industry back in the day was the Apple and the Amazon of today. They were a titan. So I will tell you that there's certain liability with these tanks. Again, I was on the Today Show. They aired it nationally. Okay, the way it works is tank leaks, you own the property, you have to clean it up, and it's expensive to do. Okay, and real issue in real estate, and you're not really specifically looking for these as you're doing your inspections. It's not part of your tool bag. It's not something you have to do, right? But when they do leak, it's like a cancer. So how do you treat a cancer? it's really not an injection of anything. It's really physically going in there and removing it. That house had to be supported with helical piers. That's how they put like lighthouses out in the water, these helical piers, and such. It deepens the foundation, so it allows you to dig soil. So you're going into people's yards with big machines, and you think you're putting a pool in, but you're not. You're digging up oil impacted soil, right? Same thing here. And like there's an expense involved. These machines are expensive to do. Next photo you're not going to like. These people put an addition on top of their tank. It leaked. We had to support the house with steel and actually drove underneath it to get the tank. There was the tank underneath there. And the bottom right is actually what the house looked like. So not only was the tank there and it leaked, it had to be remediated to do all that. It cost a lot of money. This guy right here had an older tank in his crawl space. He put a trench drain around it for water management, and they put the tank right there. Well, it got a delivery of oil, and it had old legs, and one of the legs gave out, and the line broke. Oil went into the sub pump, which discharged to the backyard, which had to be dug up. We actually have another photo where actually also went into a wetlands too. That guy spent like $55,000 to do all that. No insurance coverage. I told you before, where do people put tanks? Upper left, they put it right by the front door. This tank is the bottom left between a shed and a garage. The one upper right, underneath the stairs to the house. The one in the bottom right, they added onto the back of the house. There was a patio there, and they just built the tank. They built on top of the tank. How do you know if there's an oil tank on the property? Typically before 1980 is kind of a sweet spot for it. If the homeowner is honest enough to inform you that there is, or there's documentation, and again, your home inspections don't typically look for it. When I talk about the older the home, Sears was the big retailer, bigger than Kmart back in the day, not there anymore, right? Sears Kenmore oil steam boiler. I'm going to tell you a couple things that you might look for to give you some historical markers that a tank could have been there. The lines on the left, tanks typically work. A supply and return copper line goes to the tank. So if you see these disconnected copper lines, typically it's due to that there's a tank outside. On the right-hand side, you'll see two pipes. How tanks work. Oil goes in one pipe, air goes out the other, makes a whistle sound. That's how the driver knows the tank is getting near full and to stop doing it. Upper left-hand corner, that's a vent pipe to a tank, painted the color of the foundation. Looks like a mushroom. To the right, that is a fill cap to an older style tank from the 1950s. Bottom left, that's a fuel filter for a tank. Bottom right, those are two sets of lines coming from the tank. One went to the heater, one went to the water heater. You go to a property, and most of the time tanks would be by the AC unit, close to where the heater is to the house. 90% of the time, not all the time, but about 90% of the time. The reason being is the heater can only pull the oil so far, so it's not going to be 100 feet away from the house, like say a propane tank. So in this circumstance, someone said, oh, there's no tank here because we removed it because you can see the dead body. But you would look like a dead body. Looks like someone did a grave. Same thing on the right-hand side. You could tell that excavation was recent because you see the sidewalk there cracking. This is actually not a tank. Someone said it was. It was actually a cap for a fence post. And how I know that is in the next photo. It was in a driveway, and we dug it up, and that's what they actually got. Okay. But I'm going to give you some, I'm going to pitch things underhand to you regarding some tanks. On the right-hand side, wealthy people had gauges inside their house to tell them how much oil was in the tank. On the right-hand side, oil burner emergency switch. I tell people, you typically don't see an oil burner emergency switch if there wasn't an oil burner. All right. That's an old style fuel filter, kind of it's based in brass. Someone said that this was a oil tank underneath a back porch. It actually wasn't. We actually scanned it, and it was actually a well point for irrigation. This is actually a tank inside someone's garage. The photo on the left, you can see where the fill and the vent were, and this tank wasn't removed. It was kind of cut open and cleaned and filled and left in place. That tank did not leak because it really didn't get wet because there's a building on top of it. Typically, tanks under grass tend to leak more rapidly or rust more rapidly because moisture is hitting them. Drier the tank, longer its life expectancy. This tank was actually put inside of a garage. You can see it right there. Someone said it was a water tank. As you look at the photo on the left-hand side, you see a little water pump there. And I said, people didn't really install water tanks. These people, circa $1,900 $1 million home, they tried to hide their tank from us. And you can see that that's a vent pipe right there. Really looks like plumbing parts. Again, fuel oil dealers did things willy-nilly any way they wanted to do it. Okay. And these people were actually in real estate, and they redid their driveway and tried to hide the tank, but they left some key markers that we were able to locate. We also used ground penetrating radar to find the tank, and they were quite upset that we did this. To remove that tank, you had to dig up all that stamped concrete, and you're never going to get it completely matching. These people put the tank under the front porch. Anywhere you want to do it. This is actually off the eastern shore of Maryland. That's actually a fiberglass ball tank. I think it's kind of cool, but you can see that they stopped using that tank because the photo to the right, you see that they have a newer above ground tank. This is actually a repeat of the photo I just showed you. I apologize. Caveat emptor, buyer beware, right? But caveat venditor, let the seller beware, okay? Sellers have liability for their disclosure. And I said, I'm in New Jersey. It's a very litigious state. The saying goes, people sue at the drop of a hat. Okay. And it's the case because people will hide things and cover things up because they don't want it to be found, because if they find it, there's going to be an expense involved. Okay. So part of the whole due diligence, obviously, mortgage companies want to do title search to make sure there's a free title, there's not any other encumbrances. You want to appraise the property. Home inspection, I know a lot of home inspectors, and I always tell people home inspection is like a home education. It's your line of defense in like buying a property, and typically you're buying a used home, so you want someone to be able to look at it, okay? But there's also due diligence of tank scans, tank sweeps. You're specifically going onto the property looking for a tank, okay? Your inspections kind of exclude looking for tanks unless you see something glaringly obvious to point out, right? I'm going to talk to you about how 2 different ways people look for these tanks. Some people buy a metal detector and they scan the property thinking that the metal is the only thing. We are in New Jersey. We're close to the New Jersey shore, and you will see some weird people with a metal detector trying to find valuables along the beach. And they typically don't pull up in a Rolls Royce. It's typically a beat up Honda, all right? And they find a lot of bottle caps, all right? Using metal detectors works in theory if it's the only metal on the property. You have no metal utilities, no metal above ground for the signal. And I'm going to kind of go in a little bit of history of this. Gustav actually created the original metal detector, but using a metal detector to find a tank is kind of like using one of these cell phones, right? You can get a metal detector for about $1,000. This is a Schoenstatt. Surveyors tend to use it to find survey markings because you're looking for a small near surface pin to find the property boundaries. But if you go to their website, you see what they recommend that they can use to find. And the one thing they can't find is tanks because it's not on there. It's actually, if you use it for a tank, technically you view it as being, it's misconstrued as you're using it for a use that's not actually advertised for. Just talks to you about the detector. There's another detector. This is a little more expensive, but it's trying to pick up a magnetic field. But again, if you go to their website, they talk about golden treasure, security, industry, utility, and industry. Well, here's a great little story. All right. Alexander Graham Bell, pretty smart dude, right? We've had several presidents who were shot. James Garfield was one of them. He was shot. Graham Bell was nearby and said, you know what? I'm going to create a metal detector, put him on a bed, and I'll find the bullet and we'll pull it out of him. He couldn't find the bullet because the president was on a bed that had a box spring made of metal, and the metal detector was non-discriminatory. He died. True story. You look it up. Flaws of metal detectors, people put rebar, wire mesh across concrete that you can come up with. All right. Also, like this was a property worked at. Someone said there was a tank there. It was a big, long tank. It was actually a stormwater right away. It was a metal pipe going through there. This property right here, there was an investment group out of California who bought properties. Someone did a tank sweep, said it was a tank. And the 2 upper photos are connected to that site. We actually just dug up some buried metal. What it was there for, I have no idea. I suspect kids buried as like buried treasure. Bottom photo to the left, someone said that it was a tank. We dug it up. It was actually a big rock. And the rock absolutely had metal in it, metallic properties, but it was not an oil tank. But these are things that someone with a metal detector said because they're scanning for a tank and they didn't quite know what they're looking for. This property right here, someone scanned the property with a metal detector and they missed the tank. Okay, the reason being is the metal detector was going off the whole way along that ramp because the ramp is concrete reinforced and also has metallic railing to it. It was actually scanned eventually with radar, and we found the tank. And a very simple thing for you to look for, dead center of that photo is a chimney. There's a heater on the other side of that. The fuel source for that, be it gas or oil, would typically be coming through that wall. It's a perfect spot for a tank to be. This property right here, photo to the right, that is the sewer line going across the property. Someone scanned it with a metal detector and couldn't find a tank. Scanned it with radar and a tank was found because it's non-discriminatory. There definitely was a big pipe going through there, but it confused the metal detector because they got a very long signal. And the metal detector kind of went across the tank, and I'll tell you why. If you look at the top right-hand photo, you see the sewer line going out. You see a water line going out, which was copper. Okay, not going to pick that up. But there's also two copper lines that go there to go to the tank. So the tank and the water line, everything was together and was not able to be determined utilizing a metal detector. How people look for tanks on like commercial properties and better searches they do for residential properties is they use ground penetrating radar. You're pushing a cart that kind of looks like a electric lawnmower, but it's actually a ground penetrating radar unit, and the engine on a lawnmower is actually an antenna, sends signals in the ground. And when it comes across a tank, you get the signal of like a mountain because tanks are round and it reflects off of that. A missile type shape would be like a utility because the pipe is small. This photo right here, there was a tank under that asphalt. So it can go through asphalt and you can pinpoint it. And this is a little photo collage right here. 2 layers of asphalt we cut through, and there was the old fill pipe. So they basically cut the pipe to put another layer of asphalt on to hide the tank. This tank was a tank that someone had filled in place. And how they filled it in place was they left the oil in the tank and they filled it with sand because everyone says, you know, sand is an absorbent, and it's not, it's an adsorbent. All right. So oftentimes we find tanks that people left in the ground because dad had to put shoes on you kids. And when he converted to natural gas, there was a cost involved with that, and they left the tank in the ground. Okay. And then environmental regulations came into play, and these tanks that were sitting with oil, they leak, and there's a cleanup involved for owners. 3 people passed when the gas was installed. So saying someone converted to gas in 1970, and today maybe someone's buying the house and they find out there's a tank there they never knew about because they never did any kind of research to evaluate it because they didn't realize that you know, oil would have been a possibility because natural gas has always been prevalent. It's funny, like people will call us and they'll refer us, like some realtor will refer us, and I ask the person, what's your realtor's name? I don't remember. And I'm like thinking, like, you worked with them for, you know, so many weeks to buy this property and you can't remember their name. And you realize that it's so stressful for people buying a property that, you know, the financial aspect, moving from point A to point B, all the houses they have to look at, finding one that you like, negotiating and everything, and getting a home inspection report with like, oh my God, this house, all this stuff that needs to be done with it, all this deferred maintenance. And they don't always listen to the advice that people have regarding, you know, should we get this radon inspection done? Could this old house have asbestos in it? Sure, it could. It's an old house. Like, you know, it was a green building product, you know. Tanks are kind of fallen by the wayside in some people's thought process until they hear a story about someone who spent $50,000, $100,000 cleaning this up. And again, it is not fair. The government basically says when you find contamination, when you own it, it's your responsibility. Just for, you know, kind of, I'm going to wrap this up in just a couple slides. Another thing involved with like people don't want to deal with the tank, and I showed you that first one in Atlantic City that they tore down the building, but they left the tank in the ground, right? Because you have to have training to go inside of a confined space. OSHA has regulations regarding that. You have to have proper personal protective equipment and such to do it. This kind of gives you a little background on me. Normally I do this, I show people in the class, I said, where am I in this photo? And they're like, where are you? And I'm like, I was in the tank. All right. What I've told you, I've kind of shared in a very quick format regarding my experience with liabilities with tanks, and they're typically really financial. Most of the time, obviously for propane, it's a financial cost, and it happens all the time that a home inspection is done and they see the tank there and they just, oh, there's really not much to it. But people say that, but I'm like, if I told you it's going to cost $6,000, would you consider that to be an issue? I would consider that to be an issue. Okay. Regarding oil tanks, it's a matter of like, is the tank there? Like, we got a lot of calls during COVID because people had above ground tanks in their basements, okay, and they weren't using them, and they wanted to start using them because they wanted more space. They're like, I've never used this, and they spend money to do this. I'm like, if I knew how much the above ground tank was, just the cost of the labor and everything to do that, they're like, I would have asked them to do that before I bought the house. Conversely, we get things that happen in like spring and winter where temperature changes and the metal in the tank has fatigue and it gets cold and hot and the rust holes open up, and this tank that is unused, that people say there's no liquid in it, 50 gallons are in it, oil leaks out of this unused tank sitting in a basement. I say this to you because you're probably going to come across properties where people have out of service above ground tanks, and there may be no regulation in your state saying you have to do anything with it, which is fine. But what I'm telling you is that's one of the largest containing vessels in the house. You may have several 5-gallon buckets of paint or whatever, but 300 gallons, 290 gallons of capacity, and if you have 50 gallons in it, it's a 55-gallon drum. At some point, it's going to leak and it's going to run out, and bad things will happen. Bad things. I hope you found this somewhat educational, and I hope I kept you awake regarding the whole thing. I'm wrapping up a little bit early, which is kind of unheard of for me. I typically go well beyond what it is, but I tried to rush through it because I didn't want to take up too much of your time. So I'm going to end it now. I hope you have a really great day, and thank you for listening.